Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we're looking at the love poetry of the great Romantic poet, John Keats. The best things we have come from madness. John Keats died only 25 years of age after contracting tuberculosis. During his lifetime, he was a remarkably unsuccessful poet, despite being propped up by Leigh Hunt and his band of radical writers and poets around the newspaper The Examiner. Despite his premature death and relative obscurity in those years, Keats grew in immortal fame afterward, becoming a sort of priest and prophet for the more radical romantics of the later 19th century, who dreamt of abolition, emancipation, and revolution. Keats grew up in the shadow of the French Revolution, Napoleonic War, and the Metternichian settlement, which reacted harshly against the radical politics of emancipatory and revolutionary Jacobinism, a politics that Keats was initially favorable towards. Keats also grew up in the bosom of materialism and an emerging utilitarianism in his native England, the same hollow materialism that saw earlier forebears of his, like Jonathan Swift, rebel against. It goes without saying that Keats's two greatest intellectual fantasies and interests, love and radical politics, were suffocated by the general currents of his day. Give me woman, wine, and snuff, my beloved trinity. Keats's sensual and dramatic poetry, a quote I just read, in its eroticism and veiled social commentary, earned him, during, again, his rather unremarkable life, the scorn of Tory reviewers in the English press, which was the primary reason he labored in relative obscurity until after his death. The negative reviewers that dominated the English intelligentsia killed his poetic career, but luckily did not kill him for posterity. While Keats saw a vulgar superstition in the melancholy church bells and gloominess of horrid sermons in his day, seeing Christian Puritanism as a soul-crushing and love-suppressing religion that contributed to the eradication of romantic love and the consummation of men of cruel clay, there is, of course, a tragic irony in Keats's flight from Jerusalem and his indulgence in the ruins of Babylon. For as every scholar and biographer knows of John Keats, Keats was also very much indebted to the cultural currents of Christianity. He was educated in a nonconformist school, which prioritized the freedom of the conscience. He was also saturated in the very religion whose essence is supposed to be love, and Keats, in criticizing certain aspects of medieval Christianity, was arguing that Christianity didn't live up to its actual fulfillment. The love that never dies, but lives as immortal Lord, is not the paganism of Kronos overthrowing Uranus, or Jupiter assaulting Ganymede, but a paganized window dressing of the Christian theology of love. William Wordsworth rightly described Keats's poetry as very pretty paganism, but the romanticized and mythologized paganism of Keats, while vulgar in its sexual yearnings and fantasies, was a paganism that was as much demythologized from its actual roots as it was also remythologized from an unconscious theological and divinized inheritance coming from Christianity. This paganized Christianity, which Keats and other second-generation romantics indulged in, would fit nicely into certain circles today, the new humanities and humanistic movement, promoted, ironically, by the forms of Christianity that Keats was put off toward during his lifetime. The disordered passions that Keats eulogized in his poetry was the exhaustive end of a world that the baptized heart of sacramentality and the demands of a life of sacrifice stripped away from it through the hollow bells as well as the empty spirit of materialism. The world that Keats was yearning and opining for was the world destroyed more by Enlightenment materialism and the philosophy of scientific conquest than anything else. The Romantics, as virtually every historian knows, wanted to re-spiritualize and re-poeticize the world. Christianity, insofar that it had failed to preserve the sacred world of spirits and mysticism and mythology from the onslaught of industrial science, oftentimes becoming an ally of industrial science, led the Romantics to rebel against their own inheritance, as well as to revivify it with a new culture and a new spirit of eroticism. Keats, along with the other Romantics, wanted to resurrect the spiritual conscience, a world of understanding that was deeply sacramental without the sacramentality of the church. Keats didn't want to wait, therefore, for the day of resurrection, for love to be fully consummated in the present. He wanted it now. Give me, woman, wine and snuff, until I cry out, hold enough. You may do sans objection till the day of resurrection, for bless my beard, they aye shall be my beloved Trinity. The impulsive passion and fantasized love, this sacred sacramentality that Keats wrote of, could only have emerged, as everyone knows, from a theological culture which prized beauty and love, the union of Athens and Jerusalem. But the romanticizing of the fairness and sensuality of this world as something noble and indeed salvific was only possible from a pen who had inherited that theological culture. As mentioned, Keats was steep in the Protestant nonconformist tradition, as well as the humanistic tradition of the Catholic Renaissance, although that wasn't something that in 19th century England one should always be upfront about. Thus, Keats is actually engaged in a remarkable poetic project of synthesis, trying to bring new life to both the mythological world and imbuing it with a new theology taken from Christianity. Part of Keats's project, then, was to re-enchant the dead world, the world destroyed by industrial science, the world that both ancient paganism and contemporary Christianity was no longer able to sustain. This effort was needed in his day, and one might say remains needed in our day. In the Eve of St. Agnes, one of Keats' later poems and a rich masterpiece, tells the tale of two virginal lovers erotically embracing each other and fleeing outward into a world of storm and tempest. This poem, more than any others, so concisely captures the mad love of Keats's poetry. The educated reader is torn between shock and sympathy as he writes soteriological poetry in the cold and dark confines of Christianity. All the while, the very spirit of Christianity, as we've been talking about, looms over Keats's entire project to the knowledgeable reader who knows theological history and education. At the beginning of the poem, we are introduced to a beadsman in a cold and frozen environment. The cold and frozen environment, like Dante's hell, is symbolic of the coldness of a place without love, without a heart. Very quickly, however, we learn that the beadsman is praying the rosary, and Keats's condemnation becomes clear for all readers. Christianity is in part responsible for the coldness of the world, now occupied, which forbids romantic love. The beadsman is too busy praying and engaged in a cold ritualistic piety than he is living a life of warming love, which he is actually called to do. Keats's social commentary is at once esoteric as it is exoteric. As the beadman retires inside a house, which is reminiscent of a monastery or a Christian chapel, his death bell rung. Inside this cold and moonlit place now are two impassioned virgins, Porphyro and Madeline. Keats's imagery and descriptions of their fantasizing and bodily actions can only be described as the descriptive language of someone filled with boyhood fantasies. But Madeline's sensual dancing and undressing and Porphyro's lust tells another story. Madeline is a modern girl, repressed by the structures and world around her. Porphyro is an old god, like Cupid, needing to rescue his Psyche. Madeline, for light and warmth, to re-enter the world. Keats, as we know, was a Philhellene, not altogether dissimilar from the other Romantic poets from England, like Lord Byron or Percy Shelley. That the two lovers have two radically different names, one hearkening back to antiquity and another common to 19th century England, is very much part of the story of erotic revival that Keats wishes to tell. Moreover, Madeline's transfiguration is reminiscent of Aphrodite's birth, and Porphyro's gaze, like any prepubescent boy longing to be in the place of Paris at the judgment of Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera, surely gets the heart boiling as one reads the poetry. Porphyro and Madeline are both resurrected in their longings for love, the sacred power and the resurrecting spirit of the romantic heart. Porphyro played an ancient ditty long since mute, and as such, Madeline awoke, her blue afraid eyes wide open shone, as she uttered a soft moan. In this moment, perhaps the mad climax of Keats's fantastical imagination, the first contrast to the coldness and frozenness of the dead world that we were introduced to, is revealed. Porphyro's whispering and pleasant playing is described as warm. Furthermore, the flight of Porphyro and Madeline from this imprisoning castle begins at dawn, the sun rising in the world, in contrast to the cold and dark night that dominated much of the poem. The burning hearts of Porphyro and Madeline burn for the illicit loves of the body, crackling away in the frying pan of sensualism, instead of finding the love offered by the author of the love that governs the sun, the moon, and the other stars. Keats's love poetry is a remarkable achievement, all things considered. Yet, as most scholars would say, it pales in comparison to the substance, as well as to the lyricism, of that other and perhaps greatest love poet, a theological poet, George Herbert, who predated Keats. In contrast to the great English poet of centuries earlier, Keats's eulogies of love border on mad parody, and of course leads our protagonists to an uncertain future. But the love that Keats is wanting, the love that Keats's protagonists desire, is very much powerfully captured in the poetry of Herbert. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. In the contrast of love poetry between Keats and Herbert, the reader of Keats's love poetry will often notice two very distinct differences. Though the poetry of Herbert and Keats both eulogize love, and even though both the poetry of Herbert and Keats praise the salvific and revivifying power of love, the poetry of Herbert, being fused with theology, leads love to serenity. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. The poetry of Keats, by contrast, ends either in death or in uncertainty, a forensic running away, as Porphyro and Madeline are at the end of On the Eve of St. Agnes. Keats, though, desired the nourishment and fulfillment of love, even the love of one's moment pleasure. Hither, hither, love, 'tis a shady mead. Hither, hither, love, let us feed and feed. Where Herbert's love, informed by Christianity, is satiating, redeeming, and leading to serenity, Keats's love is ultimately always fleeting, and as mentioned, ends with death or disappointment. Hither, hither, love, this boon has sent. If I die and wither, I shall die content. Herbert's nourishment of the soul from the plate of true meat shows ultimately the emptiness of the carnal meat that enslaved the romantic heart and imagination. The bright torch and warm love to which Keats and his poetry sings is ultimately a different love from the love praised by George Herbert. But nevertheless, we can see the similarities between the two. Keats wants a world of love. He understands that this love is something sacred, and he sees the world that he lives in as a world stripped bare by the materialism, by the industry, by the science, and even by the cold, rote mechanicalism of religion. Keats wanted a world where love can bring new life. Ultimately, though, he was unable to find it, and this is shown in his own poetry, again, where either death or uncertainty befalls our great protagonists. But despite that uncertainty, despite the death that fills his poetry, we cannot help but love the poetry of Keats, because in our own lives, we see Keats and Keats's poetic characters as ourselves. We too often live in a cold, dark, mechanical, industrial, scientific world where love has been stripped away from everything, and where the only sense of religious and theological spiritual piety is the rote praying of prayers, rather than a mystical, sacred encounter with love. Ultimately, that is what Keats's poetry was really bringing us to, and what he actually sought. He sought it in the food and the lives of people in this world, hoping that it can bring the nourishment of the soul, the contentment that we all ultimately seek, and that we all know is impossible in this world of the empty rainbow.